Hello and good afternoon from my end, or it might be a good morning for those in different time zones. Thank you very much and welcome to this session that I'm very excited about. And today we'll be discussing all about how foundations can align their investments and their grant making behind their mission in partnership with Mercer. My name is Shafi Musaddiq, and I am the news editor for Alliance magazine. To delve into all of this and more, I'm delighted to welcome some fantastic people and organizations who are tirelessly working in this space. So, with me today are Clara Miller, former president of the Heron Foundation and pioneer of mission aligned investing, Roy Swan, director of mission investments at the Ford Foundation and a member of the Church of England's Investment Oversight Group. And we have Tamara Larson, US Values Aligned and Sustainable Investments Practice Leader at Mercer. Before I begin the conversation, just a few things for everybody watching. There are two ways you can get involved. Firstly, feel free to introduce yourself using the chat function on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You should be able to see a little speech bubble. You can also use this chat if you're having any issues with your audio or video. Our team are on hand behind the scenes to help you out if you need it. You can also put questions to the panelists at any time using the slider Q&A on the right-hand side of the screen. As well as asking your own, you'll also be able to upvote other people's questions that you'd like to see answered. I'll be keeping an eye out on this throughout the webinar and selecting questions that Clara, Roy, and Tamara will be answering during the Q&A at the end. Should you wish to do so, on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, you will see a CC button. That allows for closed captioning in English and several other languages. We encourage you to use this if needed. And finally, for those of you who are not subscribed to Alliance magazine, you can use the code EVENT24 in capital letters to get a 20% discount for full year subscription. Find out more with the link in this chat. So, to begin the conversation, there are increasing calls for foundations to align their multi-billion dollars of investments in the global capital markets with their mission for public good. Is this a realistic ambition? What are the barriers to achieving it? The first guest I will introduce is Tamara Larson. So Tamara is a partner at Mercer and, as mentioned before, is the US ESG investments practice leader. She's got over 22 years of investment management experience and is a leader in values aligned investing for institutional portfolios. Tamara was previously a managing director at Agility, where she's led the mission aligned investment practice and was a member of the investment committee. Before joining Agility, she was also head of private markets research for Russell Investments as well. So, Tamara, you have well over 20 years of investment management experience. Tell me and tell all of us how, in your view, mission aligned investment practice has changed in the last 20 years.
Shafi, certainly a lot has changed in 20 years, and I'm not going to take offense at you kind of tying that back to how long I've been in the industry and aging me. But a lot has happened, but I think there's certainly a few dynamics that are worth outlining and discussing with you all. The first, I think, is really important. The opportunity set for mission aligned investing continues to evolve and deepen for both market rate and concessionary investment opportunities. But on the market rate side, we've really seen a meaningful expansion in the opportunity set across asset classes. So I'm not just talking about venture capital and real assets. We've seen a very deep opportunity set for climate lens investing there, but really seeing a deep opportunity set in private credit, private equity, public equities, fixed income, a really broad set of opportunities that you can access on a multi-asset class basis. In addition to that, we're seeing a maturation of different segments and sectors of the market, and a broad opportunity set across different themes and different asset classes. So financial inclusion, health equity, climate and decarbonization, affordable housing, and beyond. I'll just give you a personal example. Over 10 years ago, when I was underwriting mission aligned strategies in private markets research, some of those opportunities were relatively unproven. And there were often questions that I would get from my investment committees about what the exit market pricing looked like and how deep the market would be when it was time to get out of those investments. And I can tell you from personal experience that those were really challenging meetings, right? When you have relatively unproven strategies, not a deep well of data pricing on, data and pricing on what the exit market would look like. It could be very intense conversations. But from where we sit today, the exit market for market rate mission aligned investment opportunities has grown and matured. There's a deep well of data points of pricing across various thematic opportunities, and across asset classes. So that's really meaningfully changed the contours of investment committee discussions. So hopefully they're not as challenging as they were for me in those situations about 10 years ago.
And I think we've kind of mentioned privately, Tamara, that there's been a sort of historically siloed approach of people without investment experience, people particularly on investment committees. Tell us about how that experience has changed.
Yeah, so as I was just saying, sometimes, there tend to be this siloed approach where people who were pushing for mission line investing didn't necessarily have those seats at the table, right? And take a line from Hamilton, in the room where it happens. They weren't necessarily on the investment committees or in the portfolio manager seats or on the transactions teams that have really made the portfolio allocation decisions historically. But now we really have a deeper bench of professionals who have conventional investment experience, who are authentically committed to mission aligned investing. And they can get as technical as any person on the venture capital transaction team, public equities, private equity, any subject matter expert. They can go head to head with them, right, on any of the conventional metrics of success for an investment. And that has really resulted in a very powerful and important dynamic where you have a deep well of investment opportunities that are market rate. They're across asset classes, they're across themes, and you have investment practitioners with the technical investment know-how and track records to be able to have those engaged discussions and make those portfolio allocation decisions.
Roy, I see you nodding, and I will come to you in a moment. So keep those thoughts there. I can see you bursting. Um, I want to bring in Clara Miller. Clara's camera unfortunately isn't working, but she is there. Clara Miller is a writer and speaker and advisor on investing and finance in the social sector. She is a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and president emerita of the Heron Foundation, which she's led between 2011 and 2017. Prior to assuming Heron's presidency, Clara founded and was president and CEO of Nonprofit Finance Fund between 1984 through to 2010. Clara, I know from your point of view that there is an increased hybridization, for want of a better word, or blurring of the business world and the non-profit world. In your point of view, do foundation staff need to better understand where their grant making budgets come from? I know you have strong views on foundation staff, on their understanding or lack of understanding on the basics of investments.
I guess I would say staffs. It's very heartening to hear Tamara's presentation and see Roy nodding, because when I started out, things were not that way. And I can tell you that if we think about staffs, the business model of foundations, of course, is weird, because there's one side that's the investment side, and the other side is the grant making side, as if there's only, there are these two economies. One is dedicated to chaos and evil and making problems, and the other's dedicated to being the cleanup crew. And of course, that's not the case. And happily, the Tamaras and the Roy Swans and the various others in a growing infrastructure for the field are starting to get that right. But in a foundation, staffs include both the investment side and the grant making side. And I think there are better questions to ask than where do our grant budgets come from? One question I would say that both the investors and the grant makers need to ask themselves is, what does money have to do with our mission? You know, if our mission is education, let's say, you don't just put a dollar bill on a child's forehead and the child miraculously learns to read. There's something in between that dollar and that child. And that almost invariably involves an enterprise of some type. Underneath the asset classes, there are enterprises. And learning about how to invest in enterprises for positive outcomes is key, and understanding how enterprise finance works, I think. The second question that I think is important for foundation staffs to know the answer to is, and we used to do this at the Heron Foundation when I was there, is to say, what's the best use of a foundation dollar for mission? Whether it's an investment dollar or whether it's a buying dollar, a dollar by which, most grants are basically you're purchasing services from enterprises out there. That's a deceptively difficult question. It's deceptively simple. And the final question I think that's helpful, and it's kind of in the advanced class, is what is our financial role as an institution? What's the array of our financial roles and financial tools? Are we a buyer of services? We don't really have that much money, so maybe we shouldn't be buying services. Maybe we should be taking a leverage role, taking a role as a capital provider, which is a different role. So I guess the sum total of this is not so much grant makers should know where their dollars come from, and it could be, if they're climate change grant makers, it could be an oil company. In fact, it's almost invariably going to be true. They should know how to use finance as a tool in their work. And that has to do, I think, with enterprise finance for understanding. So I'll leave it there.
That's fantastic, Clara. And I know you have thoughts. We've previously had a conversation between us about this idea of the evil economy versus the good economy, and it's a false dichotomy in your view.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's definitely one. We're all in it together. And when I was at Heron, and people would ask me that, are other foundations doing impact, doing impact investing? I would invariably answer, yeah, they all are. They just don't know if their impact is positive or negative. And of course, over time, impact, just like financial performance, impact performance goes up, and then it goes down, and then it goes up. And so the idea of, blessing one part of the economy or one kind of organization versus another as being good versus bad, I think is a big mistake. I think that there are high road companies in every industry vertical in the capital market, and a world of possibilities. And I think, the kind of what Tamara is saying is so heartening to me.
I think that leads me very nicely onto Roy. Really grateful for Roy to be here. Roy Swan, inaugural head of the Ford Foundation's Mission Investments Program, which deploys endowment capital for market rate impact investments, program related investment capital for catalytic opportunities, and grant capital to support the global impact investing and ESG ecosystems. Roy, you've led the mission related investments at the Ford Foundation. And as many of us on this call know, in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, Ford issued $1 billion in debt to help stabilize other nonprofits, and it enabled Ford to dramatically increase its spending. It was a controversial move at the time, but I think it's broadly well received. My question to you is, what is holding foundations back from investing more of their assets in alignment with their mission?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And it was I was nodding my head like one of those toy bobbleheads I know while Tamara and Clara were talking. And I just want to acknowledge Clara. There are many people responsible for me being in my favorite job of all time, and Clara's leadership in taking a notion that was a term that was coined, I think it was 2007, impact investing, at a Rockefeller Foundation convening. A couple of my colleagues were at that meeting, my boss, Darren Walker, and my teammate, Margot Brandenburg. So that's led me to this great opportunity. The second thing I'll say is one of the first people I met was Tamara Larson, and I was surprised that someone of her talent existed in the. I was surprised and pleased that someone of Tamara's talent existed in the impact investing world, because as Tamara pointed out, it's come a long way in a relatively short period of time, and what's happened is great talent has transitioned from what has become known as traditional investing, which does not take into account negative externalities. And I think Clara put it well, all investing has impact. The question is whether it's positive or negative. Economists call that sort of externalities. And that's a really great thing, because the reality is, I believe that well-executed impact investing is more difficult than traditional investing, because it requires not just the basic investment analysis, but it also requires disaggregating the details to try to determine what are the externalities and how can we drive them. And that challenge and difficulty, I think, is a part of what's holding back foundations from doing more. There's no reason that every foundation in the country should not be doing impact investing with all their capital. There's no reason that I see, other than the reasons I'll go through, which I've spoken about in various forums. I think the main one is fear, and it's a fear based largely on a lack of knowledge and a cognitive bias that automatically assumes that you can't do well and do good. People love to say that, but I don't think as many people who say it really believe it. And fear can be a foundation of inertia. It can keep people in a default mode setting of standing still. And why take the risk of doing something you haven't done before when you can just keep doing the same thing that everyone's doing, and you're in the fat, happy middle of the crowd? So there's a herd mentality component. So the lack of knowledge and awareness is really important, because if you haven't taken the time to study what types of businesses can produce positive externalities, then it can be scary. But there's plenty of examples out there going from back to times when before impact investing existed. In fact, the U.S. government has been one of the greatest impact investors in the world. What some people call government spending is actually much of it is impact investing, because it's investments in the foundations of technology, of operational research design that produces jobs, that produces affordable housing, that created the internet. I mean, there's so much. The other thing I'll say is bad incentives. And by bad incentives, what I mean is that people's compensation schemes are set up in ways that may not be good for society, may be great for their bank accounts, but may not be great for society. And so the question is, how can you create incentives that will make talented people behave in a way that is good for society? And job security, and job security captures all this. There's just the fear of failure. And one of the great things about the Ford Foundation's Board of Trustees is they have trusted. Now, I also think of President Reagan's Trust but Verify, but they trust us to do the right thing. We know what a perpetual foundation needs to deliver in terms of financial returns. And they say, okay, go do well and do good. So that's the big picture, and the fear and lack of knowledge all plays in the decision that the fiduciary duty does not include the possibility of doing well and doing good, which is too bad. I'm glad Ford Foundation got over it with a toehold, and I'm really excited that the California Endowment has decided to, following in Clara's footsteps, FB Heron, California Endowment just announced, I don't know, within the last 2 months, they will allocate their entire endowment to mission-related investments, and I applaud them for that. So I should stop now.
No, that's fantastic. I can see Tamara nodding. I'm going to bring you in, Tamara, if you wanted to expand on Roy's points, particularly on the California endowment, because that was huge.
No, I think there's a lot of excitement. I think, trailblazers like Clara and Roy and others, have really kind of set the path for these types of things to happen and really cast a broad net for recruiting who could lead it, right? That kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that there's this deep bench of professionals with practical experience that have credible, underwritable track records of authentically implementing mission-aligned investing across asset classes, across big institutional portfolios. That was something that was much harder to access 20 years ago, and I think it's been a sea change. So it's really exciting to see this level of commitment and activity amongst big institutions that are, doing this work in an authentic way.
Most
Yeah, I think
definitely.
there's really, I mean, if I can, so just like Apollo, BlackRock, Blackstone, Carlyle, KKR, TPG, to name a few, just like they have hundreds of billions in multi-asset class AUM, there's no reason an impact firm today couldn't have hundreds of billions in multi-asset class AUM that is dedicated to producing positive externalities. Yeah, the talent is available. I believe that there's capital available, even if it's not at the foundations. I think that there's certainly wealthy individuals. I think many of the wealth management firms, some of the big investment banks, many of their studies show that particularly millennials are very interested in the way their capital is invested and the types of impacts companies have on society and planet. I think it is a great opportunity that someone someone will take, and I think all of us on this phone call will be there to help.
And Roy, you make a really great point there. And it's not just young people. I think across the board, there is a concern that we need to have uncomfortable conversations. And one of them, and I'll put this question to you, Clara, I'll bring you in here. Is it ethical for foundations to invest assets in banks, for example, which finance fossil fuel companies? Clara, if you're on mute, you're muted right now if you're talking.
There we go.
Yes.
That better? Okay.
Go ahead.
I think, and I'm frustrated because Tamara and Roy can't see my face and my bobblehead nodding, and it's really wonderful to hear from them. But I think it's a much more complicated question than a kind of a lights off, lights off. It's a lights on, lights off. It's another false dichotomy, and I think that simple divestment may not really accomplish much. You have to own a heck of a lot. You know, Archimedes had the quote, if you have a lever long enough and a fulcrum big enough, I'll move the world. Well, if you have enough shares of Exxon Corporation, you can move Exxon. And, you know, so that can happen. And I think that might be a very interesting thing for a group of foundations. And, you know, that's been tried with engine number one, but in Exxon. So there's that opportunity. But I think that, as I said, you know, organizations get better and get worse. We need oil and gas companies to make the green transition. How do we find ones that are leaning forward on the proposition of transitioning their own businesses and leading the green economy? Is there a way to look at an ethical oil and gas company? I think there could be, and to become patient investors in that company, and to also be, you know, irritated shareholders and very smart ones like Tamara and Roy, who are not, you know, not just talking about culture wars. They're talking about business opportunities, stranded assets. You know, why are they ignoring, you know, 99.99% of science out there? These are things that a reasonable investor should be worried about if a company is acting that stupid. So that's more like it from my point of view, as opposed to, you know, do we dump our shares of Exxon or do we hang on to them? I think that has, you know, doesn't have as much impact as one could in owning those shares and engaging with that company.
So if I can, thank you for that, Clara. I just want to jump in on just to talk about real quickly the Ford Foundation. We did halt new investments in companies exploring fossil fuels several years ago. However, we totally agree with Clara's point, and I don't mean to be an apologist for fossil fuels companies, but I do want to say that there's been a massive backlash against ESG, and I think I guess propellant for that seems to have come from fossil fuel industry and states that benefit from the fossil fuel industry, and that's understandable. I've commented before that when your wealth is tied up in something, an industry or an asset, whatever it is, and your livelihood, how you put food on the table for your family, is tied up. Well, when ESG ratings agencies call what you're doing evil, what do you expect people to do? I would expect them to be defensive. It's kind of human nature. So I think there's an opportunity for foundations to play perhaps a stronger role in policy making. and the way the U.S. government helps the U.S. economy through various industrial transitions, we could probably do a better job if we can stop demonizing all forms of government spending, which kind of has some commentators backed in the corner, and start thinking about how government investment can generate returns to make everyone better off. That may open the door to provide the appropriate type of narrative and financial support to make people in those industries that we're going to be phasing out. We're choosing between an industry and saving the planet. But let's minimize the suffering as well as we can. So I think there's a more of a government investment opportunity to go along with foundations work to help reduce the unconstructive defensiveness that is a reflection of human nature and self-preservation, and focus on the common good, which is for all of us, whether all your assets are in fossil fuels company, whether you depend on fossil fuel company for your livelihood, we can all be better off. And the transition that Clara talked about is doable if we just turn our attention to it in a productive way.
There's so much to unpick here, and I'm trying to play devil's advocate for a little bit because you're all nodding in agreement, which is great. I love that. But Tamara, I want to bring you in as well on this because, for example, when we talk about ethical endowments, is the price, for example, is the price of an ethical endowment a smaller endowment? Because there are some fundamental questions that need to be asked here, and that's one on the agenda right now in the circles.
Look, I said before, obviously I'm someone who believes that you can take a market rate approach and generate compelling investment returns that are aligned with the growth of your endowment, whatever your starting size is, in mission aligned investing, and that you don't have to compromise on the growth trajectory of your endowment through endowment investing, portfolio investing, with mission alignment. I think going back to what Clara and Roy were just saying, I definitely think stewardship is a big part of the picture here. And what we're seeing amongst our clients and some of the foundations that I'm engaged in is, really wanting to have an impact on the priorities for mission alignment that these foundations are thinking about and focused on in the real economy, in our real society. And stewardship is such a big part of that. It's not just carving it out of your portfolio. It's how do you engage with the stewards of your capital in the broader capital market? So the fund managers that are deploying capital on your behalf. So how are you engaging with them on these issues of utmost importance to you as an organization? And then in turn, how are you incentivizing them to engage with the underlying companies in the portfolio around these issues? And so stewardship has become, front and center, with the recognition that stewardship doesn't always work. You can engage, and so one of the questions that we ask oftentimes is like, what is the time period of engagement or stewardship? And when you don't see the responsiveness that you want to see, then do you take the step of considering other alternative options available to you within the portfolio to access that investment opportunity, but with a partner that's a steward of your capital that's going to be reflecting your values and how they deploy that capital in the market. And so more broadly, I would say, those open conversations, oftentimes iterative conversations with the stakeholders around the table at foundations, are really where, the rubber meets the road around, how are you actually deploying your capital in a very intentional and thoughtful way and authentically around mission aligned investing. And so there's not this, what I would consider a false dichotomy, that in order to be ethical, you have to shrink, that you're not engaging in the market and accessing this broad opportunity set that exists.
Yeah.
I'll just add to that a bit. And because it gets back to kind of the false equivalencies, false dichotomies. Um, and a part of this depends on your impact framework. So for example, the Ford Foundation, we don't have a generalized impact framework. We have specific impact themes. Our impact themes are based on big social problems where we believe we can allocate our capital and generate risk-adjusted market rate returns appropriate for a perpetual foundation. And one big problem we identified, which is a source of, in my humble opinion, almost every single social problem that exists in the US, and that is the devastatingly destructive imbalance in the control of capital. In a capitalist system, if you do not have access to capital, you have a very big problem. And in the US, of the 80 plus trillion in assets under management, just 1.4% of that is managed by firms owned only in part, just 50 or 25% owned by women and people of color. Women and people of color make up 70% of the US population, control 1.4% of the assets. For Black people, and I single out Black people, both because I'm Black and because Black people are at the bottom of the Fed's research on the economic pyramid. So Black people are at the very bottom. So I'll pick the worst off. Roughly 25 basis points, so less than 1% for a group that represents about 14% of the population. That's our problem. And going back to the lack of awareness, lack of knowledge, fear, I saw research by my old firm, Morgan Stanley, that was good news, bad news. The good news was that many of the investors they surveyed, I think nearly 70%, thought diversity was important, but a similar percentage thought that it would require giving up returns. And that is an example of a lack of awareness, because volumes of research over decades, most recently Harvard Business School, shows that particularly when it comes to Black investors, they perform at or sometimes better than the peer group, including white investors. So so I think the raising one's awareness, becoming more informed and educated, acknowledging conscious and unconscious bias would make it possible for endowments to be ethical, if ethical means having an impact, a positive impact lens. And it's just a matter of the will to lead and to actually act, as opposed to ponder and study, because the work has been done. Just as one data point, which is not, it's part of a pool of evidence, but I'll just talk about the Ford Foundation. We published our returns information way too early, after just 5 years in business. That's not really helpful, but it directionally gives you a sense. And we had a compound annual return rate of 28% after 5 years. Our financial hurdle rate is about 9%. So it's more than 3x what's required to reach our hurdle rate. So that's just one part of the evidence. There's many other bullet points, data points, I should say. But ultimately, it just comes down to the courage to act.
I am going to move on to Q&As right now. For those watching, if you do have any questions, still have time, please do pop them into the Q&A box. One question for all three of you to consider is this: how do you see regulatory barriers getting in the way of foundations to move towards mission aligned investments? This is often used by foundations I speak to as an excuse not to consider mission aligned investments from their endowments. That's from Max von Abendroth. Thank you for that. Who wants to pick up on that?
I can give you my 2 cents worth, because we rewrote our investment policy statement at Heron, and one of the points was really that fiduciary duty is not about money in particular. It has been interpreted, people hide behind it, but in fact, it's about putting the interests of your beneficiaries in front of your personal interests. That's at the root of fiduciary duty. And we defined for our own investment plans fiduciary duty as also beneficiary risk. And our own risk was beneficiary risk. And once you've started opening your eyes to that, and have been through, for example, we went through at Heron the financial crisis, and Heron had started down the road of doing impact investing long before I came. And when I arrived, about 40% of the portfolio was aligned for impact. And McKinsey had done a study declaring that if we went beyond the 40%, we would start going into the dread spend down mode, where you're wasting away your endowment. In fact, that didn't turn out to be true, and I think Tamara and Roy have talked about that. But what was true, that after the financial crisis, where our community development portfolio was the best performing asset, bar none, in our entire portfolio, which included a large conventional, 60% was conventional investing. We thought, oh, well, aren't we wonderful? We have this lovely little, kind of terrarium with teddy bears and dolls in it. And it's also got these impact investments, and that's very nice. But outside our walls, of course, the greatest stripping of assets from the poor and middle class in America, and to Roy's point, outsized numbers of people of color, Blacks and Asians and others, was taking place. And coming in were private equity firms buying up homes that were, being taken from their owners for lack of payment, mortgages going bad. And if we weren't engaging with the whole economy, our mission being help people in communities help themselves out of poverty, we weren't doing our jobs. And I think that if you say to foundations, you're not fulfilling your fiduciary duty unless you're engaging with the whole economy, I think that's reality.
I think it's really important to mention the point of the impact, especially on people of color. And Roy, I know that you're on the Church of England oversight board, and I think there was back in April, there was news of the Church of England tackling its slavery legacy. And I guess that's one example. And Roy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how institutions with billions of assets are making a start. We're talking a lot about on this call about the future, but often we forget about the past, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to clarify, it's the Church Commissioners for England, which oversees a part of the Church of England's assets. The wise thing that the church commissioners did was they acknowledged responsibility, had a truth and reconciliation process, decided that something needed to be done. Yes, they're criticized for taking such a small amount to do something in acknowledgement of the Church of England sponsorship of transatlantic chattel slave trade, but what they're doing is very important. It is addressing immorality and unfairness in what is supposed to be a beacon of morality and fairness. And it wisely pulled together some people to help them figure out how to do it and raise awareness and address some of the cognitive biases. And one of the uncomfortable truths about a part of what the church wants to do, which is provide access to capital for the transatlantic chattel slave descendant diaspora. A part of the inconvenient truth is white people will benefit greatly. And there's no problem with that, but I think for some people, they are startled by that. And the reason why white people will benefit from money being invested by Black people, even if it goes into Black businesses, is for the same reason that a former Confederate soldier who fought to maintain slavery also petitioned the US government to pay reparations to freed slaves. Never got paid. Reparations went to slave owners who lost their slave property. But the reason is white people own everything. And so a part of impact investing is buying companies. And those companies being bought are owned by white people. And they're going to get a premium on their assets. And that's okay, because we're all better off when everyone's better off. The great thing that the Church Commissioners for England recognize is it's all about creating a sense of hope for people. It's not just addressing the church's past sins. And by creating a sense of hope, it increases the level of trust. And all institutions in democratic societies are based on trust. So I just was so delighted that when I heard from the Church Commissioners for England, and they reached out to me to help them with this, and I had a chance to speak to about 500 of the leaders of the General Synod in London several months ago. And I think it's a great symbol for others who have ties to transatlantic slave trade to join in. And for those who don't have ties, but see the value of bringing hope and the opportunity for shared prosperity to others, I just think it's a great step forward for humanity.
Yeah, I can see you nodding, Tamara, as Roy was speaking. Hope is such a commodity, right? I wouldn't even want to reduce it to a commodity, but we have to think about these terms. I'm so glad that Roy has used that word. I'm going to go to another question in the Q&A. This one is from Kristen Petillon. I hope I said your name right. She asks, mission-aligned investment is a journey, including for the boards. At our foundation, we agreed to X amount of our endowment in mission-aligned. The challenge is to find investment opportunities that align well with our criteria. How can you help? Oof, that's a big question. Tamara, what do you think?
I mean, I think, with my kind of mission aligned, values aligned hat on, a lot of what we do is have the initial meetings with staff, the investment committee, even members of the board for foundations that we work with, to talk about, what are your priorities? What are the issues or problems that you're trying to solve, number one, in terms of what do you want to reflect in your endowment portfolio that aligns with your mission and values? And it's often a series of conversations that are very open about how do those priorities map to the market opportunity set across asset classes, and what does that look like? And oftentimes we'll include case studies of, this is how it's manifesting today. It might have been different 10 years ago. These are the opportunities we're seeing today, and maybe have a conversation about what we're seeing evolving and may come in the future, so that you can have these open conversations about what that opportunity set looks like, what it would mean in the context of your portfolio, and how that could be paced and phased in over time. What does that pacing look like? And then are you comfortable with that? So I think a lot of times it's having a partner, an investment manager, advisor, consultant, whatever that looks like for you, who can then have those conversations about what the opportunity set looks like, and help you to identify what are the issues that you want to solve and how that maps to the opportunity set. And then, as Clara was saying, how is that then expressed in your governance documents and your IPS so that then you have a framework, an investment framework that balances your conventional investment goals with your mission aligned goals as well. And that all of your stakeholders have buy-in on that as part of that iterative process. So it really starts with governance and transparency and openness. That's really our process.
We have time for 2 more questions. Hopefully I can get through them. Laura asks, I'd like to ask your views about the percentage of endowments that should be used for funding your partners. What is the fair amount to be paid out? Who wants to take that one on?
Well,
Laura.
if I understand the question right, I can attempt, and then Roy and Tamara can clean up with some facts. But basically, a foundation, at least in America, has a tax rubric that includes spending 5% of its asset value every year on a 3-year rolling average, blah, blah, blah. And so that's our tax rubric. That's not our strategic imperative, however. So when we look at the opportunity set that's out there, we then revert to that question, what's the best use of a Heron dollar for mission? Assuming that we're going to be in business as long as there's, it's an anti-poverty mission, as long as there's need for our mission. And that would seem to be something like perpetuity. Then it starts creating a framework from which we can say, let's look at that entire opportunity set rather than coming up with a number that is a hard and fast, we gotta do X. Now, that said, we have a tax rubric. We have to pay out, 5% per year. Is that the right number? Not always. Sometimes it's bigger. Sometimes there might not be all that great opportunities to spend the money. So I think that the whole enterprise, once you start thinking of the foundation and the undertaking as a whole enterprise, then you're managing a very different kind of organization where you're saying, we're going to deploy all of our financial strength for our mission, whatever that looks like. And we're also going to comply with our regulatory rubric, and we're going to stay in business as long as we need to. Those are just management challenges. They're not, there's not somebody hasn't descended from on high with a stone tablet saying, thou shalt, make X percentage of your, except for the IRS, of course, in the US. But at any rate, that's my point of view about it.
And I'll just add that to Clara's point about sometimes you spend more. That's why we did the bond a couple years ago. There was tremendous need in the fallout of the COVID pandemic. We thought about, do we spend down our endowment? But we did some financial analysis and say, you know what, borrowing costs are so cheap, it's highly unlikely we're not going to be able to achieve returns that are higher than the borrowing cost. So we went out and leveraged our credit rating and borrowed $1 billion for the exclusive purpose of giving away every single dollar because there was need. We also, on an annual basis, give in excess of the 5% because we've identified need in excess of 5%. That makes it harder from an investment perspective to make back that money for a perpetual foundation, but we embrace that challenge.
I will throw one more question to the 3 of you before we wrap up. This one's from Marlies Kim. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. She says, they say, I have seen mission investments starting to align with grant program strategies, but have not seen grant programs geared towards addressing barriers to mobilize investment in high impact areas, thereby potentially mobilizing much more investment for the cause and delivering much more impact than each of the programs could achieve alone. I hope that made sense. Roy, you're nodding.
Yeah. Ford Foundation, if I'm understanding the question right, we've done it several times. We helped start the nonprofit affordable housing industry with grant money, and we have made market rate investments in some of the funds that they've raised. We also helped launch a financial inclusion type firm, and not just Grameen Bank in 1980, but also I think it was 2010. We funded a spin out from a nonprofit that was a financial inclusion fintech venture capitalist. And we went from grant type funding to program related type investment funding to market rate funding. So those are just two examples. I'll stop.
That's great. I wish we had an extra hour on us, but unfortunately we don't. Um, Before I wrap up, I just want to take a minute each from each panelist on final thoughts. Essentially, I want each of you to answer the question that we posed right at the beginning on aligning investments and grant making. Can foundations do it? Clara, I'll start with you.
Okay. They not only can do it, they have done it. And so there's no place to hide anymore. It's time. It is hard work. It is different. Roy talked about all the barriers. I think he's absolutely right. People don't like to change. People don't like to get rid of their incredibly profitable, risk-free job, but we got to do it. This is incumbent upon us. This is about ethics, plain and simple. This is about what we're supposed to be doing in the nonprofit sector, and that would be the foundation world.
Tamara?
I would add that, contrary to historical approaches and mindsets around siloed approaches where you have to make a false dichotomy, a false choice between one versus the other, mission aligned versus market rate, there's actually synergies of accessing mission aligned market rate opportunities across, again, multiple asset classes, multiple sectors, multiple geographies, that actually can result in an outcome that's more than the sum of its parts. There's synergies, there's multiplicity, there's a powerful synergistic dynamic that can be accessed, and we have this deep bench of investment practitioners that are ready to do it.
And Roy, ending with you.
I'll just add, it's both and. So the approach we took was, what's our intellectual capital base provided by our grant making team, past and current, and where do we think we can make returns appropriate for a perpetual foundation endowment. And so not every category fit today, but in the past, there have been categories that did fit. A recent example of where we leveraged expertise from our grant is when we acquired shares in Anthropic, which is a large language model, artificial intelligence company that spun out of OpenAI because the founders who were formerly with OpenAI wanted to have an artificial intelligence company that where the number one priority was AI in service to humanity and in the service of safety to humanity. And we relied on our tech and society team to help us vet that opportunity. So it's a both and approach, and we've taken a problem solving approach with the goal of finding the overlap of problems that can be solved via market rate capital.
That's a great place to finish. That's all we have time for. I wish we had an extra 2 hours, but nobody has time for that. But within the 1 hour, I hope everybody on this call got something. Thanks to all three of our panelists for their insights into this vital issue. And thanks to you all for listening and for your questions to the panel. Alliance will be hosting events next week on whether the philanthropic world is ready for new ways of funding. Make sure you're on to get the invite for that and future events. So please do subscribe to Alliance's newsletter. There's a link in the chat. For now, thank you, Roy. Thank you, Tamara. And thank you, Clara. We know it's morning for you. So thank you so much for joining, and hopefully see you soon. See you later.
Thanks again. Take care, Al.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.